my family, Walter's family. It was really very nice.
Oh, good.
Mm-hmm.
I'm so glad to hear that.
Yeah.
Menucha, how was your Passover?
It was very good. Very nice. Spent lots of time with my grandchildren and my children. Lots of cooking, yeah. But it was
That's
good.
for sure. Lots of cooking. Lots of cooking. Lots of kitchen time. Yay. Lots and lots of time spent cooking and serving and cleaning and reheating. Yes, lots and lots of kitchen time. But thank God, all in the name of liberation. It was a very joyous holiday. Of course, very work intensive, but also very, very, very joyous. Anyone else have something they'd like to share from Passover? Anyone else have something they'd like to share from their Passover?
It just came.
I see. It's interesting. Everyone jumping on now. Okay. All right. Well, we are getting back to Rus. So we will, it's been a while because I think we had a week that we didn't learn because it was Passover, and a week at least that we spoke about Passover. So it's been a while. Maybe we spoke about Passover for 2 weeks. I don't remember. Yeah, we spoke about Passover for 2 weeks. So it's been 3 weeks, but hopefully it was very meaningful. I worked very hard. Passover requires a lot of work, and it was very joyous. It was very joyous. I still haven't completely gotten out of my Egypt. I'm still working on it. It's a process. Egypt isn't so easy to escape. You can get rid of one layer, but there's more lurking in the cracks and crevices of our soul. So we have to work hard to get out of all those Egypt. But it's a worthwhile journey. It's a very, very, very worthwhile journey. It's a journey that's so liberating. It's so liberating for us, and we have to really seize the opportunity. It's like God's giving and I'm not going to take. I want to take. He wants to give. That's a great match because I want to take. So he's giving freedom and I just have to walk toward it. And that's the Passover experience. And even though Passover ended last night, but we can still keep walking toward our freedom, walking toward liberation, walking toward escaping all those things that are barriers for us in our relationships with other people, in our relationships with ourselves, and our relationships with God. All part of the process. All right, so let's make our blessing. Baruch Adonai Eloheinu Melech Haolam Bachar Banu Nicole Mim Minasan Lanu Paraso Ata Adonai Nosein HaTorah Ma Israel Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. All right. So we said it's been 3 weeks since we learned the book of Rus. We're at the very climactic moment and we took a 3-week break because we had 2 weeks that we were discussing Passover and 1 week that we experienced Passover. And as I said, I hope we all worked hard, part of the package deal, experienced liberation, and are still walking toward it. So we're up to chapter 4, meaning we did the first verse of chapter 4 weeks ago. So I think we're going to go back just to remind ourselves. So at this moment, just remembering the storyline because it's been a while. So Rus, the convert that some accept as a convert and some don't from Moab, has come back. The former princess didn't go back to the palace when her husband of 10 years died. She's childless. She could have gone back. She said no. She went with her mother-in-law back to Judah, back to Israel. They're completely destitute. And she goes, as the poor are allowed to, gleaning in the fields, where the first day she goes, a relative actually, Boaz, her deceased husband's cousin, notices her. Boaz is quite older than she is. She's 40, he's 80. Boaz is the leader of the Jewish people. And Boaz is very kind to her. And Naomi is hoping that Boaz will marry her. As we will discuss today, remind ourselves the concept of the Levirate marriage, of marrying a relative who was died childless to perpetuate the memory of that deceased. But the whole harvest passes and Boaz doesn't say a word. Naomi is hoping during the harvest Boaz will do something. He does nothing. Then Naomi tells herself, well, he was a little busy during the harvest. After the harvest, he does nothing. Then Naomi thinks we're getting quite desperate here. Desperate situation, desperate measures. And she sends Rus to Boaz that night while he's sleeping, guarding the granary, to speak to him to get him to do something about the situation. And he agrees to do something. He doesn't say what he's going to do, but he says he'll take care of it. So the next morning, he walks her home, because it probably wasn't too safe for her to walk alone. And then he continues on to the gates of the city, where again, he is the chief judge of the Jewish people. So there's his court. And Boaz wants to take care of the situation. Now, what will be taking care of the situation? Helping Rus and helping her deceased husband by creating this Levirate marriage. So let's just remind ourselves what this means, a Levirate marriage. So that's the English word. In the Hebrew, it is called yibum. And what it means is that if someone passes away, absolutely childless, but potentially could have had children, but yet somehow didn't, there is an obligation on the closest living relative, biblically we view it as the brother, who was alive during this deceased person's lifetime, to marry the widow to perpetuate the legacy of the deceased by a child being born who is spiritually a continuation of the life of the deceased man. Now, the first time we see this obligation in Torah is with the sons of Judah, Yehuda, who were married to the very righteous woman Tamar. And when the first son, Er, died, childless, Judah told his next son, Einan, okay, now you have an obligation to marry your brother's widow to have a child to perpetuate his memory. So that is exactly this concept. Now, the Zohar, which is of course the foundational work of Kabbalah, of the esoteric wisdom, the Zohar explains that if someone passes away, this doesn't remove him from his roots on this world. Now, normally, how a person continues his legacy on this world is through his children. When you have a child, you have a piece of eternity. Because that child, God willing, will have a child, who God willing will have a child, who God willing will have a child, who will perpetuate you forever. That's why, of course, intermarriage is such a tragedy when the spouse, when the woman is a non-Jew, because there went that whole line. But a child normally is perpetuating your memory forever. So if someone passes away childless, well, there goes it. His line's cut off. His mission's unfulfilled. He stopped. That's it. He's dead. He's gone. There's nothing continuing his legacy on earth. So to maintain this departed person's link in the chain of life, we want to give him a child. And that's the purpose of this Levirate marriage. So it's that the newborn child is sort of like the receptacle, in a sense, for the soul of the departed, through which his mission in life is going to continue. And he will also have this piece of eternity. Additionally, the husband and wife are considered like one unit, like one body. And that's why it's her responsibility to continue his life, to perpetuate his life through this Levirate marriage. Because it's almost like with the passing of her husband, a piece of herself died. Part of her own body passed away. So when we have this brother, as biblically it's explained, this brother who's the closest to the dead man because they came from the same parents, this would be like that piece of herself that died is being revived. Now, before the giving of the Torah was given 3,333 years ago, 50 days after we left Egypt. So we just left Egypt a week ago. So in about 40 days, we get the Torah for time 3,333. Prior to that, this secret, this mystical concept of the Levirate marriage was known to the great people of the generation. It was like a secret. So Judah, who was definitely one of the greatest people of his generation, he knew this secret. And then once Torah was given 3,333 years ago, everybody knew it. It's a commandment in Torah. But in the Torah, the commandment is on a brother. And as we understand it, that's it. Meaning, if a dead man passes away and he doesn't have a brother, that's it. We're done. Nothing to talk about. But it seems on earlier times, because this was such a spiritually significant salvation for the departed, that if there wasn't a brother available, another close relative would do the same thing. Again, biblically, the only obligation is a brother. That is a true obligation. It's still true today, though, as we explained in earlier classes, nowadays we don't do the biblical option of the Levirate marriage of Yibum. We instead perform another alternative concept called chalitza, which is a ceremony involving a tribunal Beit Din court, which is not a marriage and does not produce a child, because we're told we're not holy enough to do it for the right reasons. But in original times, not only do we believe they were holy enough to do it for the right reasons, but if there were no brothers available, they would go to the next closest relative. Now, to understand our story here, now that we got the background, so Rus was married, as we said many times, to a man named Machlon. Machlon had one brother, Chilion. Both of them died. Both of them actually died childless. So Machlon is gone, no children, Levirate marriage. Well, Chilion's his brother's also dead. Who's left? Who are the males that are a close relationship? There were exactly two. Machlon had a living uncle, and Machlon had a living cousin, and that's it. It was not a very large family. The living uncle's name was Tuv, and the living cousin's name was Boaz. Boaz was not Tuv's son. He was his nephew. Let me sketch out this family tree. Rus is married to Machlon. Machlon's father's name was Elimelech. Elimelech had two brothers, Solomon and Tuv. Boaz's father, Solomon, is gone. So we have Tuv, Elimelech's brother, Machlon's uncle. And we have Boaz from the other brother, Solomon, Machlon's cousin. So of the two, Torah says the uncle is a closer relationship than the cousin. We might think the cousin's closer because it's sort of the same generation, but it's sort of like you could have one uncle and many, many cousins. So he happened here have one uncle and one cousin, but you could have many more. So the uncle is viewed as a closer relationship. So therefore, since this concept, which is called redemption, the person that marries the woman is considered the redeemer. He's redeeming the woman and he's redeeming the deceased man. So it's a double redemption. So the redeemer, the closest redeemer, is the one who should have first dibs. And that would be Tuv, Machlon's uncle. If Tuv is unwilling, it would then go to the next in line, which is Boaz, Machlon's cousin. So that's the background to understand what we're now going to learn in chapter 4. So we're up to chapter 4, and we're going to do again verse 1. Boaz, meanwhile, had gone up to the gate and sat down there. Just then, the redeemer, meaning this potential redeemer of Rus, from her widowed state and childless state, and the redeemer of her deceased husband, Machlon, from his childless state, the redeemer of whom Boaz had spoken passed by. Remember, when Rus went that night, last night, in our text, it was only last night. By us, it was like a month ago. But in the book, it was last night. When Rus had gone last night to Boaz to ask him to redeem her husband, he said, there's another redeemer who's closer than me. This is the person he meant, his uncle, Tuv. So the redeemer from Boaz had spoken passed by. Imagine that. How, as we say, hand of God fortuitous. Boaz is looking for this redeemer, his uncle. No text, no WhatsApp, no email, not even a phone. No problem. God makes him walk right by. So Boaz said to him, come over, sit down here. And the verse does not say his name. I'm telling you his name. His name was Tuv, which actually means good. Tov is good. The verse doesn't call him by his name. The verse says Ploni Almoni, which means like, we would use it nowadays to mean like so-and-so. Like, I'm not saying your name. Hey, so-and-so. No, obviously, this is Boaz's uncle, and he knew his name, and he didn't call him so-and-so. He didn't say, hey, so-and-so, come sit down. Probably said, my revered uncle, Tuv, come sit down. But the verse doesn't say his name. It says so-and-so, and he came over, Tuv, and sat down. So that's the first verse. So a little commentary on this. So Boaz, again, let's remember the storyline. Rus comes to him at night. He is shocked. Remember, he woke up from his sleep. He sees a woman. He's scared. It's who knows what, an apparition, a force of evil. Controls himself, doesn't do anything violent like curse. Realizes it's this woman, listens to what she has to say, assures her he will take care of her plight. She wanted him to marry her. That's in essence what she was asking. But Boaz said, no, there's someone closer in line than me. I will take care of it, meaning I'm going to go get this other guy to marry you. How does he find him? He goes to the gate. He made a promise to Rus. He's got to fulfill it. So he goes to the gate to try through going at the gate, then trusting God. God's going to deal with it to fulfill his promise. Now, Boaz, again, as we said, was the judge of the generation. He was the head of the tribunal court, the largest court, actually, the Sanhedrin, which is a court of 70 elders. So here, he's going to be part of 10, the elder of 10 plus him. But he was the head, and as such, he went to the gate to be the head and trust God to deal with it. Now, when we think of the gate, don't think of it like a little, like, gate around your house or something. Just think of it like if you've been to the old city of Jerusalem, the gates around the city of Jerusalem, these are quite large edifices. So, because the gates were designed to protect, the gates had a functional purpose. It wasn't just a line in the earth, like, hey, here's as far as the city goes. it was protection. It was the best protection they had. It was a fortress to protect them against the enemies. So the gates were quite thick, and things happened by the gates. So as we know, we're told this in many places. One of the things that happened was the courts met by the gates. Disputes were brought to the courts by the gate. Disputes were settled by the gate, and Torah was taught by the judges of the court by the gate. So the gates were a very happening place. So Boaz goes to the gate for his court to deal with this situation. So what does he do to deal with the situation? Like I said, couldn't send Tov an email, no text, no WhatsApp. I guess I assume he knew where he lived, but he didn't even send a messenger. I don't know why. He just sat down and said, listen, God, I did my part. I trust you're going to do your part. And he sat and he waited for God to do his part. And God did not disappoint him, because suddenly, out of the blue, look who arrives. This very Redeemer, Tov, happens to walk by. So the Midrash says on this that Boaz did his part. He went to the gate. Rus did her part. She went that night before to speak to Boaz, which was pretty brave, daring, and scary of her. Naomi did her part. She was the one that pushed Rus to do this and spent the whole night probably in prayer. So God said, I too have to play my part. I think that's a very powerful
Not right now.
I think that's a powerful point, because I'm going to rewind that medrash again. I think it has a very powerful practical lesson for all of us. Boaz did his part. Rus did her part. Naomi did her part. So God said, hey, guess what? I also have to do my part. And I think the obvious lesson in that is that, so many things are like impossible, right? Naomi is stuck. Her poor dead son, her poor widowed, destitute, childless daughter-in-law. But what could she do about it? Rus is stuck. Who's going to marry her? But what could she do about it? Boaz is stuck. How's he going to find this Tov? What can he do about it? But instead of everyone saying, what can I do? It's sad. What can I do? Each person did the best of their ability. Each person pushed and trusted that God was going to finish off the job. Like we see a famous classical example of this is with baby Moses, right? When Moshe was a little baby, his mother was trying to save him from the Egyptians. What could she do? She put him in a basket in the Nile. It doesn't sound like a great salvation strategy. It wasn't, but what could she do? She did whatever she could do. And then as his basket is floating, and Paro's daughter, who we call Basia, that was her Jewish name, sees the basket floating, understood it was a baby, wanted to save the baby. What could she do? The baby's so far. So as I'm sure we all know, what did she do? She stretched out her arm. Well, what's that going to help? The baby was much further than an arm's reach away. What could she do? So there's nothing she could do, but she didn't do nothing. She did the most she could do. God, all I can do is stretch out my arm. And that's what she did. And then, as I'm sure we all know, God extended her arm until she could reach the baby and draw the baby in. What could Rus do? What could Naomi do? What could Boaz do? They did whatever they could do. And they trusted God to do the rest. So I think it's a very powerful lesson for us. Like a lot of times in life, there's nothing we can do, but we can still do something, but it's not good enough. But we do our part and we trust God to take care of the rest. So when God sees we're doing our part, trusting him, this enables him to finish it off. And that's exactly what happened here. So he suddenly, unusually, it's not like, Tov hung out by the gates. It was very unusual. Suddenly, Tov appears. But I said the verse knows his name. I mean, it's not like I have a secret that I know his name, but no one else does. The rabbis all know his name. His name was Tov. That's still. But the verse doesn't call him by his name. It calls him Ploni Amoni, so-and-so. So some say his name isn't said because he sort of messed up here. Meaning, of course, God's plan was for Rus to marry Boaz. And Naomi wanted Rus to marry Boaz. Again, if you think about this storyline, obviously Naomi knew the family tree. It was a very small little tree. So the same way Naomi knew that Boaz was the cousin, obviously Naomi knew that Tuv was an uncle. Again, those were your exact two options of who could have married Rus in this Levirate marriage. Naomi didn't want to. She wanted Boaz. That's why she went for Boaz. She wanted someone that righteous to father the child that would be Rus's child and her deceased son's child. But still, even though God's plan is for Boaz, Naomi obviously wanted Boaz, but Tuv still, I mean, he has free choice. You could say he's a player, which he is, but it's also his script. He has free choice, and he did not do what he should have done here. And that's why we don't say his name, because it'd be like a disgrace to him, because it was he sort of messed up. He didn't do the right thing here. We look at the word ploni, almoni. Ploni means hidden, and almoni means nameless. So he's the hidden, nameless one, because we don't want to say his name because he messed up. Another way of explaining ploni almoni is someone who's mute, almon, who's devoid of Torah. Because why didn't he agree to marry Rus, as we're going to see soon? He does not agree to marry Rus because he's like, oh no, I don't want to mess up my lineage. Like, I don't know this Rus, Moabite. I don't know if that's so kosher. Well, that obviously shows how devoid he was of Torah, how empty he was of Torah knowledge, where the marriage with Rus was completely kosher. Though, of course, as we're going to mention, most people of the time also thought it was not kosher. The minority knew it was kosher. The majority also thought it was not so kosher. Now, some say he wasn't called by his name because his name was Tuv, which means good, and he didn't live up to it. Of course, that was his essence, so he could have lived up to it, but he didn't. So verse 2. He then took 10, he means Boaz, took 10 men of the elders of the city, he's making now a court of 10, and said, sit here. And they sat down. So Boaz is now making a court because he wants something to happen. In other words, why is he making a court? He wants to make here a wedding. He wants to make a marriage between Rus and Tuv. So he's creating this whole setup to like, okay, let's make this happen. I told Rus I'm taking care of it. Let's get this wedding on the way. This is actually, by the way, the source. If any of you have ever been to a very small wedding, you might know that there's a requirement for 10 men. Our verse here is the source. Based on this, we know, because Boaz wants to make a marriage, and he says, okay, he needs 10 men, meaning for a tribunal court, he could have had 3. The smallest court is 3. He didn't need 10 for the court. He needed 10 because he wanted a marriage. He wanted Tuv to marry Rus. Or if Tuv wouldn't marry Rus, he was going to marry Rus. So either way, he needed a quorum to make this marriage. And again, from here is our source that we need a quorum of 10 to make a marriage. He also wanted 10 because he wanted this law that you are allowed to marry a Moabite, a female from Moab. He wanted it to be publicly confirmed. And of course, 10 is already considered like a public situation. So he says, sit down. And again, he wanted them there because we got to make this ruling that Moabite's permissible. We got to make this marriage. I need 10 for a marriage, so don't move. Stay seated. The next verse. Then he said to the Redeemer, again, to this potential Redeemer, this perhaps Redeemer, Tuv. Now, he doesn't start with a marriage. He builds up to it. The parcel of land, which belonged to our brother Elimelech, remember again, Elimelech, Boaz's father, Salmon, and Tuv. The 3 of them were brothers. So originally there was one large piece of land. They're probably large because Elimelech was wealthy, Boaz was wealthy, probably Tuv was wealthy. So this nice big piece of land was split among the 3 brothers, Elimelech, Tuv, and Salmon. Well, Elimelech's gone, so who has his land? Tuv has his land, and Salmon's land went to Boaz. Who has Elimelech's land? well, Naomi and Rus. So the parcel of land which belonged to her brother Elimelech is being offered for sale by Naomi, who has returned from the fields of Moab. Now, to put this in perspective, the most valuable thing in biblical times was your ancestral land. So you don't want to sell it. Now, if you did sell it, depending on the sale, it would generally come back to the person during the Jubilee year. Once in every 50 years, the lands all returned. If it was fields and it was not given to the temple, you got your land back. So anytime you sold your land, it was really for however many years were left till the Jubilee year. But it was still considered like a very big thing. And our sages say you should never sell all of your lands. Even if you're going to sell your land because you're so destitute, still keep some for yourself. This is your own ancestral land. This goes all the way back to your ancestors that left Egypt. So there was a lot of, it wasn't like nowadays, okay, you sell this house, you buy this house. It wasn't like that at all. This was a very strong thing. So here, the fact that Naomi is going to sell the land means, which was of course the truth, she's absolutely destitute, which she was. So Elimelech, it was Elimelech's land. Well, he's gone, so who gets it? Well, his sons. But they're gone, so who gets it? Well, his widow and their widows. So who are the widows here? Naomi and Rus. So even though usually we would think of the men owning the land, but in this situation, there's no man left, it's the women. So this is Naomi and Rus's land at this moment. And they're penniless, as we see. Rus had to go and collect the gleanings. So they've got nothing, otherwise she wouldn't have done that. So they're now going to sell their land. Now, obviously the land was quite valuable. So they would make a lot of money from the sale. But we don't really like this idea of the land leaving the family. Again, so this was originally one big piece of land that Elimelech's father had. And then with his passing, the land got split into 3 pieces. Solomon's part went to Boaz. Tuv's part he still has. And Elimelech's part is now up for sale. So Boaz is saying to his uncle, this isn't a good situation. We don't want this family land to just be bought by a stranger. Obviously, there's probably someone that's going to want the land and they'll get money for it, but we don't want that. We want to keep the land in the family / redeem the land so they don't have to sell it. Meaning, in essence, he's saying, it's for sale, you should buy it so it stays in the family. He was also saying, redeem the land. Redeem the land would mean buy it, but give them back the land. So it really stays Elimelech's land because it doesn't go anywhere. Because you're giving them the money, but you're not taking the land. You're redeeming the land. So that's what he was asking him to do, which was a pretty big thing. Because obviously it was a lot of money. Meaning Elimelech was originally very, very rich. So obviously his ancestral land was quite valuable. So it wasn't a small thing that Boaz was asking. It was a lot of money. Even if he was just buying it and acquiring like double his own estate, who said Tuv was looking for suddenly doubling his land? Who said Tuv was looking to spend that much money on land at this point? So he was asking him for a pretty big thing, but it was like, you know, this is in the family. We want to keep it in the family. So to keep it in the family, hey, it's you or me. So you have first rights because you're the uncle. I'm just your nephew. So, you know, like step up to the plate and buy or redeem this land. And he said, continuing verse 4, I again, it's Boaz here, I resolved that I should inform you to this effect. Buy it in the presence of those sitting here. Remember, he has his 10 sages. And in the presence of the elders of my people. If you are willing to redeem, redeem. But if it will not be redeemed, tell me that I may know. For there's no one else to redeem it but you and I. And he said, Tuv said, I'm willing to redeem it. So Boaz is basically saying, listen, there's no one left in the family but the 2 of us. I know I'm asking a big thing. It's a lot of money to buy this whole parcel of land that you don't really need. But if you don't buy it and I don't buy it, it's going to leave our family until the Jubilee year. So if you can do it, buy it. That's my advice to you. That's my request from you. If you can't, no problem, I'll do it. Because we got to keep this in the family. And Tuv said correctly, he stood up for the task. He said, I'll buy it. Which is a very good thing on his part. Because again, it was a lot of land. It was a lot of money. Who said he needed the land? Who said he wanted to spend his money on it? So he wasn't like a horrible person, here. He did the right thing in this first situation. It was just only the first situation, though. He said, I'll buy it. And he even said, I'm willing to redeem it, to redeem this from this potential situation. And redeem it obviously is expressing this idea of spending a lot more money. If you're buying something, you're looking for the best price. You want to pay as least as possible. Redeeming it is more generous. You're keeping it in the family. So he agreed. Great. Now Boaz adds a little extra detail. Verse 5. Sorry. Yes, verse 5. Then Boaz said, the day you buy the field, which is supposed to be right now, that's why you have the 10 people here, so you buy this field. The day you buy the field from Naomi, you must also buy it from Rus, the Moabite, wife of the deceased, to perpetuate the name of the deceased on his inheritance. So we're simple people. So when we read that verse, it sort of is a little bit funny, because how is buying the land perpetuating the deceased memory, but whatever. We would just move on. But what Boaz was saying here was, wait a minute, by the way, it's not just Naomi's land. Elimelech didn't die childless. Elimelech had 2 sons, and both of his sons died childless. And one of his sons' widow went back to Moab, so she's irrelevant. But he also had, Machlon had a wife who stuck with the Jewish people. So she's a legit Jewish woman. Happens to be a Moabite, but she's a legit Jewish woman. She's both. So it's Naomi's land, but it's her land. So if you're buying it from Naomi, by the way, you also have to buy it from Rus. And I want you to buy it in a fashion that perpetuates the memory of her deceased husband, AKA part of buying the land is marrying Rus. Because buying the land is not perpetuating the memory of her deceased husband. But buying the land and marrying Rus to have a child, that child will get this land. That child is going to perpetuate the memory of Machlon, her deceased husband. So once, it's like you build up. Once Tuv agreed to first step, he'll redeem the land. Again, he must have been obviously a very wealthy person, because it wasn't a small thing to ask, but he was willing to do it. Boaz threw in, which by the way also means to buy the land and redeem the land, you need to marry Rus to redeem Machlon from his cut off, childless, dead situation. Now it's interesting here that he's stressing the Moabite, why does Boaz have to bring that in? Why Boaz have to bring it in? Maybe we could have slipped her in without remembering she's a Moabite. But he's sort of playing both sides. I'm making this a very clear situation. Obviously, she's a Jewish woman, because if she wouldn't be a Jewish woman, this whole situation is irrelevant. If someone marries, God forbid, a non-Jewish woman, you don't marry that non-Jewish woman to perpetuate the dead man's memory. There was no real marriage according to Torah. It's not his wife according to Torah. And if someone married that widow and had a child, the child wouldn't perpetuate the memory of the dead man. There was no Torah anything going on here. So the fact that Boaz is pushing Tuv to marry Rus to perpetuate Machlon's memory means she's a legitimate Jewish woman. This is a legitimate marriage. But I want you to understand the situation. She is from Moab. She is a convert. She is a legitimate Jew. It's all one and the same. She's from Moab. Yes. Check. She's a convert. Check. And she's 100% a legitimate Jew. Check. And therefore, even though she's a convert from Moab, no evens, no ifs, no disclaimers. She's 100% a legitimate Jewish wife, which means now a legitimate Jewish widow, which means marrying her will perpetuate Machlon's memory. And that was, of course, the point. Obviously, there's this nice thing of acquiring the field to help them out financially, but obviously that's very secondary to the real goal of Rus and of Naomi and of, in this situation now, Boaz, which is that Rus should marry that closest relative to perpetuate the memory. And Tov refuses. Tov's like, I was willing to spend a lot of money to help out my dead brother Elimelech, to help out my father and keep his fields in the family, to help out Elimelech's widow. I would do it. I can afford it. I would do it. It was nice of me. I was willing to be generous and do it. He never stepped up the plate and offered any help before, but again, also neither did Boaz. We're not really sure what was going on there. I was willing to do it. But to marry Rus? Nope. Why? What was his hang up with Rus? She was a very righteous woman, a very beautiful woman. Why would he want to marry such a wonderful woman? Because she was from Moab. Not because she was a convert per se. Again, wasn't that he had thought, oh, she's a convert. That's not Jewish enough for me. He knows a convert's 100% Jewish. A convert from Moab is also 100% Jewish. No question that the Moabite status in any way affected her Jewishness. But he felt it affected his ability to marry her kosher. And that, of course, we've mentioned before, and I would like to clarify this in a complete way now to understand really this whole concept, because, of course, as we mentioned before, it's very critical to understanding this whole issue. So this concept of prohibiting marriages from converts, again, we're not talking about marrying non-Jews. Obviously, you're never allowed to marry a non-Jew. So we're not saying, oh, you can't marry a non-Jewish Moabite or a non-Jewish Egyptian or a non-Jewish person from Ammon. You're never allowed to marry a non-Jew. All non-Jews are forbidden to marry. When the Torah says you can't marry the Moab or the Ammon or the Egyptian, they mean kosher converts, 100% Jews. But the nation you came from is stigmatizing you, is blemishing you now. So the Torah forbids, this is biblical, marrying converts from Moab and Ammon. Now, of course, nowadays it's biblical, but it's not relevant because we've got no clue who's from Moab and Ammon, because we don't know who's any of the ancient races. So it's not something that will be relevant now, but in these times it was very relevant, but it also really wasn't. Why wasn't it relevant? Because Moab and Ammon were enemies of the Jewish people. Obviously, a convert is rare. Nowadays, as we're fast forwarding to redemption, there are more and more and more righteous converts because all these sparks, every convert converts because they have a spark of godliness compelling them to convert. It's a very irrational thing to convert. You're giving up everything to attach yourself to God. Like, why are you doing this? You want to serve God? Be an Ohai. That's great. God be very happy. What are you converting for? Because you have this almost irrational spark pushing you to, not almost, irrational spark pushing you to convert. So throughout all the generations, there were converts, but it was rare. It was unusual. Like, why is someone doing this? Why choose to take on all of these yokes if it's not your thing? Now, as we're at the cusp of the redemption, there are more and more and more converts coming forth, because if they don't convert now, it can never happen. Meaning, once you have the complete revelation of Mashiach, conversion is not going to be an option anymore. So any spark that has not yet done its mission and the person housing it converted is now pushing very hard to bring that person it inhabitates to convert. Because if we don't convert now, that's it. When Mashiach comes, we're done, no option. So that's why a lot of converts, much, much more than we've ever seen previously in history, I mean, true converts, real converts, Orthodox, absolutely committed converts are happening. Historically, it was much more rare. But there always were some converts. But from Moab and Ammon, there weren't any converts because Moab and Ammon were the enemies. So God didn't put any of those sparks there. So it's a biblical law that a Moab or Ammon person, if they did convert and were an absolute authentic Jew, could not marry into the Jewish people. And very unusually, the Torah gives a reason. Why am I saying unusually? Because God generally doesn't tell us the reason for his commandments. And this is a commandment. You shall not marry a convert from over Ammon. That's a commandment. Prohibition. So we're not generally told the reasons for prohibitions or positive commandments. God has his reasons. If we know the reasons, we might think we could dance around the reasons and cut the law because we'll just keep the reason without the law. We'll get in trouble. So God generally doesn't write the reasons, but here he does because it's very relevant to the law. So God explains the reason. Why can't we marry? This is a Jewish person. This is a convert. We're supposed to embrace the converts, revere the converts, know the converts are so close to God. He's an authentic Jew at this point. Why can't we marry him? So the Torah says, because they didn't meet you with bread and water on the way when you came forth from Egypt. Meaning, when the Jewish people had left Egypt, and they were going past Moab and Ammon, they were very hungry, thirsty, travel weary. And what would have been, as we would say, menschlich, appropriate, decent conduct, is to greet these people, feed them, give them what to drink. Be nice people, be courteous, be hospitable. And they didn't. And we're told, oh, this shows in essence, they're not nice people. So even when they convert, and it's legitimate conversion, still can't marry into the Jewish people. But the sages say, now that we know the reason for the law, God's telling us the reason, so we should know that this reason doesn't apply to the women. It's got nothing to do with the women. Why? Because we wouldn't expect the women to go out and greet the Israelites in the desert with bread and water, food and water. That's not modest. The men should have done it. The men didn't do it. We have now a big complaint against the men. The women didn't do it. We're not expecting them to do it. So therefore, why am I explaining all this? Because I want you to understand that this concept that we are allowed to marry a legitimate convert woman from Moab and Ammon was always known. It wasn't something that Boaz's court innovated. It was always known. Clearly based on the Torah's reason why a male convert from Moab and Ammon cannot marry in, means women nothing to do with it. They're completely exonerated and they could marry in. So Boaz's court did not innovate that ruling. But what happened? What happened was that the people, the masses, forgot. Because it wasn't a very used law. Because there were no converts from Moab and Ammon. Because Moab and Ammon in general at that time were enemies of the Jewish people. They were always fighting with us. They're very aggressive to us. So no converts were coming forth. And I said in general, in those days, converts was far more rare than it is today. So there were no converts coming from Moab and Ammon. It's not just there were no women, there were no men, there was no nobody. So what happened? The original ruling taught by Moses and his court when the Torah was given in the 40 years of the desert was clear. All the Israelites then knew you can't marry a male convert from Moab and Ammon. But in the hundreds of years since, till we get to this situation here with Boaz and Rus, the Jewish people forgot. It became fuzzy and murky, like many things in our brain. Me, I don't remember anything that happened a week before Passover. That's way too long ago. Way too much happened since. So the Jewish people, it became sort of vague in their brains and became like, oh yeah, we can't marry a convert of Moab and Ammon. Not a male convert, but a convert. So what Boaz and his court is doing now, which actually we learned they did by fortuitous divine providence, actually right before Boaz met Rus the first time, is they reminded the people of the original ancient ruling. They told the people, clarification. We see your misunderstanding of biblical law. You're getting confused and thinking it applies to both genders, male and women from Moab and Ammon that are true, authentic converts. It doesn't. And it's not that the sages are innovating this twist on the law. This is clear from the law itself. The fact that God writes the reason, obviously that reason is only applicable for the men. So initially, God's law was only for the men. But again, that was taught to the Jews some 300 years ago when they, when they were in the desert before they entered Israel. Now they've already been in Israel for about 300 years. 300 years is a while. I was actually thinking that, when over Passover, I was thinking how we think, oh, wow, the Exodus took place a mere 3,333 years ago. Imagine sitting down by a Seder and saying, oh, yeah, remember the Exodus that took place 150 years ago, 250 years ago, 300 years ago. I mean, that was the time of Boaz and Rus. It was literally 300 some years after the Jews entered Israel. Not so long after, but long enough for things to get very murky. So this whole original ruling was very unclear, which is why for the average Jew at that time, just as they knew there was a prohibition on marrying a true convert from Egypt, and that had no gender, no man, no convert man or convert woman. There's a prohibition on the mamzer, no gender, man or woman. So they just made an assumption, the same way the Egyptian is no man or woman, the mamzer is no man or woman. So too, the convert from Ammon and Moab is the same, both genders. But here they were very mistaken. And again, what sometimes happens in this situation is, as we forget, things change. And if there wasn't this dramatic situation with Rus and Boaz, probably until today, maybe people wouldn't misunderstand the law. Again, today you could say the law is rather irrelevant in that we don't know who's from Moab and Ammon. But the whole law, we wouldn't know, be in the dark. Just as happens in we honestly have this. Like, for example, in the Torah, Parsha Shemini actually speaks about laws of kosher, this week's Torah portion. So it speaks of a kosher animal. A kosher animal has signs. The two signs of a kosher animal has to have split hooves and chew its cud. Great. What are the signs of a kosher bird? We don't know the signs. So how do you know it's kosher? Oh, very simple. The Torah lists what's not kosher because the high majority of birds are kosher. There's about 20 species that are not kosher, and all the rest of the bird kingdom is kosher. Wow, there's so much bird you can eat. Not really. Why not? Because we don't know which those 20 species are. We used to know 3,333 years ago when Moses was teaching us the Torah in the desert. We knew, but guess what? We forgot. So what do? So we only eat a fowl that we have a tradition going all the way back that this is what Jews ate. And based on that tradition, we accept that this is one of the high majority of kosher fowl. But all the rest, even though probably many are kosher, we don't eat because we don't know. And if we don't know, we can't eat it, even though probably God lets, but who knows? This could be from the not kosher. We don't know. We don't eat it. So there are things that sometimes we don't know. So this law was something that the people didn't know. Again, they didn't know, but they didn't know. And to the degree that when Boaz's court is proclaiming this and saying, you're allowed to marry a woman convert from Moab. You're allowed to marry a woman convert from Ammon. Tuv didn't accept it. Again, too, Boaz's uncle, obviously a righteous person, an honorable person, great lineage, great money, distinguished person. Boaz is saying, marry this woman to perpetuate Machlon's memory. And Tov says, no, I can't do that. I don't marry a Moabite woman, even though she's a Jewish woman at this moment. I can't marry her. That would mess up my lineage. So Boaz's court is ruling it's kosher, and Tov is saying, I don't know about that. And then, as of course happens, as we know, Boaz marries her. Great, happy ending. Well, the next morning he dies. So obviously all the wags of the community say, oh, he married her. Oh, he died. Oh, his court said he could marry her. Obviously we understand what happened here. So even when Rus's baby was born, some people were happy, but a lot of people were like, I don't know if he's so kosher. And thus it continued actually for generations. This question, was it so kosher? Is that marriage so kosher? Was Boaz allowed to marry Rus? So even though the court is ruling, and the court is really not initiating anything, it's reaffirming something that was originally known for Moses, it still took the Jewish people a long while before they really accepted it. So that is the background to this. We are going to continue next week hearing Tov's rejection of Boaz's offer and what happened next in the storyline. We are continuing in the laws of the Sabbath, of the Shabbos. Of course, we had taken a break for 3 weeks, 1 week for Passover and 2 weeks for the laws of Passover. And I hope everyone had a very joyous Passover and a Passover where they felt the energy of redemption. I hope that was felt. I hope that was experienced. So just one more law here, continuing with the ideas of Shabbos. So if one wants to serve, and actually is supposed to serve hot food on the Sabbath. So you could say, I don't have to bother with hot food, I'll just eat cold. But actually the sages would like you to eat hot food on the Sabbath for various reasons. But they also instituted how you should eat the hot food on the Sabbath. And what one needs to do to clearly demonstrate that you're not cooking in the same way we cook during the week is to cover the fire and cover anything that could adjust the heat. And that's what we do to mark clearly that this isn't regular cooking. In other words, and also for ourselves not to forget, because if you're cooking something on the stove, you see, oh, my fire is a little too high, lower it. Oh, my fire is a little too low, raise it. On the Sabbath, you can't lower, you can't raise. Both are prohibitions. So by us having the fires covered and the knobs covered, this is very important because some people make the mistake. The Jewish Yiddish word for that piece of metal that covers the fire is called a blech, means piece of metal. But if your blech just covered the fire, but the knobs were exposed, it's not kosher enough. The fire has to be covered and the knobs, because the knobs are really, in a sense, the whole point. The whole point is you can't raise or lower the fire because that would be cooking and that's forbidden. It would be a biblical prohibition. But if the fire and the knobs are covered, one is clearly showing to all this isn't cooking. I mean, this isn't normative cooking. My pot's on a piece of metal over a fire. And it's also a reminder to you, oops, I can't make a mistake and raise that fire. I can't make a mistake and lower the fire because to get to those knobs, I'd have to pick up the metal. And why is that metal over there? All right, because it's the Sabbath. Now, additionally, because you're not allowed to cook on the Sabbath, but we are allowed to create a situation that will maintain the cooking. That means the food has to be, to a certain degree, cooked before the Sabbath. How cooked does it have to be? So we would like it to be at least 50% cooked. If the food is 50% cooked when the Sabbath comes in, then that's cooked enough for it to already be considered cooked, and therefore can continue to simmer on your covered by something, preferably like something metal, fire, and knobs. Let's say you're running late and is not half cooked. What's the minimal if you're in trouble? The minimal if you're in trouble is a third cooked. So if you know it takes an hour to cook chicken and you cooked it for 20 minutes, you're okay. It's not great. If you cook it for a half an hour, you're very okay. But if you cooked it for 20 minutes, you're okay, just passing okay. And then you can put it on your fire with the flames covered by this piece of metal and the knobs covered, and let it continue to cook into the Shabbos. Now, let's say you don't have a fire. Let's say you have a hot plate. Like some people keep their food on a hot plate to keep it hot over the Sabbath. Does a hot plate needs to be covered? Well, it depends. If there's any knobs or dials that regulate the heat of it, they would have to be covered the same way. If you put your food in a crock pot, you would have to cover the knob of the crock pot the same way, because it's just like the knob of your range. If your hot plate had knobs, you'd have to cover it the same way. If your hot plate does not have any knobs, that you just plug it in and whatever it does, nothing you can do to regulate it, then there's nothing to cover. So you don't have to worry about covering anything. There's no exposed fire, so you don't have to cover the fire. And there's no way of regulating the heat, so there's nothing to cover. So then you do not need any covering, and you could just put your food on the hot plate, which again has to be ideally at least a half, and minimally, this is a real bottom line minimal, a third cooked before the Sabbath begins. But again, if your hot plate had knobs to regulate it, those knobs would have to be covered the same way the knobs of your range have to be covered, the same way the knobs of your electric burners have to be covered. They all have to be covered, both to signify this isn't cooking, and for you to remember this isn't cooking and not come to make a mistake. Any questions on that? Any questions on any of the laws I just reviewed?
Reverend, I have a question. I know, I learned that you can also, if you put the food raw, if it's completely raw, you can put it in the oven or wherever right before Shabbos starts. But is that, I'm just a bit not sure about what it means exactly before really Shabbos starts.
It's in theory okay, but in practice it's not, because exactly as you're saying, when you light your Shabbos candles, it's really 20 minutes before the Shabbos starts.
Right.
So if you put an absolute raw piece of meat in your oven or on your stovetop, it's not right before the Sabbath starts, because you still have 20 minutes. So you're in trouble. So we don't do it.
Okay.
So it is a law, and the person that taught you correctly.
Okay.
But what they forgot to say is we don't do it practically, because it's not something we relevantly could do.
Right. Okay.
Like if your husband, a second before the Sabbath began, put that raw meat on the flame, it would be kosher, but that's the only way it would be kosher. And who's going to trust their husband to do that, please, right? So we don't do it. We don't do it.
Okay.
But again, if you're in trouble, you think of the cooking time of, again, is it at least a third cooked? Or will it at least be a third cooked when Shabbos comes in? Now, again, that's also something else Miriam raised, which is a good point. Your food's not a third cooked. You're going to light the candles. But there really are 20 minutes between when you light the candles and when Shabbos really comes in, so to speak. Now, obviously, cooking on a small flame covered by a piece of metal is going to be pretty slow cooking. So it's not the same as oh yeah, it takes 20 minutes in my oven. It's going to take 20 minutes on my range covered by a piece of metal. No, it's going to take a lot longer. But if those 20 minutes will help, you can use them. Or maybe a more practical example, because I have to unfortunately confess this happens to me sometimes. It does. The food is supposed to be cooked and the food's supposed to be hot. You can't take cold food and then heat it on Shabbos, because that's also changing its situation, especially if it's a liquid like soup. Because when a liquid becomes totally cold, it almost loses completely its cooked status. So that soup has to be hot when Shabbos comes in. Not just a third hot, it has to be completely hot. So you're about to light your candles and you were sort of running late, didn't realize your soup is not hot. Can you leave it on this over your range with a piece of metal that we call traditionally a blech? Are you allowed to do that? Well, if you can calculate that in the 20 minutes between now and when it's sunset, the soup will get hot, you can. because that means it's going to be hot when Shabbos really comes in. Not when you're bringing it in 20 minutes early as you're required to, but when Shabbos really comes in, it will be hot. But if you're like, no way, that big pot of soup, my little flame, it is not going to be hot. Who am I fooling? You have to take it off higher then, and next week, remember to start heating it earlier. I've had these situations. I know about this. So, you know, sometimes it's hard. You're so busy and you're like, oh my, or it's not, you even put it early, but it's a big pot of soup and a little flame under it. And you forget that the flame has to be a lot higher to heat up that whole pot of soup. So it should be hot before Shabbos comes in. So you could calculate in those, like I'm saying, 20 some minutes until Shabbos really comes in after you light the candles. But again, you have to be realistic, understanding the size of your flame and the quantity of food that has to get hot to sort of make a fast calculation. Is this going to work or not? Any other questions? Okay. Well, thank you so much for joining. Passover is a very intense experience. So probably the day after, everyone feels like the day after something very, very big happened. It's actually interesting. In the thought for today, the Rebbe writes a thought for every day of the year, Vav Rebbe, and the thought really expresses the energy of the day. And the thought for today is like, basically, when Passover is over, you're re-entering the real world, as we call it, real world. And it's like, oh my gosh, how do I go back into that space? How do I cope with all that stuff that I put on hold for 8 celebratory days? And the Rebbe says that's why the last day of Passover, the energy of Mashiach is shining. So we can integrate that and have the energy to go back into that world. And I guess go back with joy and go back with freedom. So definitely the day after Passover is a hard day. And thank you everyone so much for joining. And know yesterday the energy of Mashiach was shining in a way it only shines on that last day of Passover. And hopefully we all consciously or without even knowing absorbed a lot of that energy and therefore have the ability to live in this world focused on God, joyous and liberated. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.